Hello, good evening, and thank you for joining us. My name is Yvonne. I'm a person in long-term recovery. Happy National Recovery Month. Glad that you can rejoin us tonight for our Burke's Speaker Out Loud series. This series is being brought to you to extend to you information and raise your education and awareness regarding pathways to recovery. What we know is that there are 23 million people in the United States that are living in long-term recovery. And we also know that there are different pathways by which they are achieving wellness, well-briety, long-term sobriety. So tonight we want to bring to you someone who's going to speak with you about Recovery Dharma. This is a live Facebook, so if you have any comments or questions, I'm going to be in the background kind of fielding some of those comments and questions so that at the end of Matt's presentation about Recovery Dharma, he can perhaps answer them for you. But we hope that you will enjoy tonight's conversation or information sharing, and we hope that we will raise your awareness about well-briety, sobriety, recovery, and then learn even more about Recovery Dharma. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Matt.
So good evening, everybody. Thanks for being here with me tonight. Feel really blessed, privileged to get to share tonight, to get to be a part of this event, to be a part of the Rise Center. I feel very grateful when I was asked to help organize some of the programming at the Rise Center, and I was asked primarily, I believe, because of being a part of Recovery Dharma here in the Reading area. And I'm going to talk about that tonight. Yvonne used a number of different terms to talk about sobriety. I have been clean for a little over 11 years. And throughout that time, I've used a number of different ways to introduce myself: addict, alcoholic, person in long-term recovery. Recovery Dharma is a fellowship that just introduces, we introduce ourselves by our first names. And lots of people probably qualify themselves in any number of different ways, but just for tonight, I'll say, my name's Matt. And we'll talk a bit about my story, how I found Recovery Dharma, and not qualified to speak on behalf of Recovery Dharma. So some of this will be my experience, some of this will be my interpretation, and some of it will probably give many of the basics of what our fellowship is like. And it's a fellowship that has, I didn't get sober in Recovery Dharma, and I'll tell that piece of it as I go along. And it may have made all the difference. I believe it was about 5, 6, 7 years. I don't know off the top of my head when I found this approach to recovery. And it was in a time in my life where things were, I was sober, but things weren't going all that well. There was some challenges, some real difficulties and struggles in my life. And it has introduced me not just to practices and principles, which are quite important to me and dear to me, most importantly to people. There's a word used in Buddhism, if you don't know by now, that Recovery Dharma is a Buddhist-oriented approach to recovery. There's a word we use, Sangha, which it's a Pali word, the language spoken by the Buddha. That word means community. And not unlike other recovery fellowships, community is one of the foundations of our program. It's one of our points of emphasis in Buddhism. And one doesn't have to be a Buddhist. One doesn't have to feel a particular call towards Buddhism, certainly not a conversion to Buddhism, to use Recovery Dharma as a as a path towards recovery. What in Buddhism, however, is held up as perhaps the three most important things would be the Buddha, the historical Buddha, the man who found enlightenment, who gave us these teachings, not as someone whom we worship or not as someone who is divine in any way, but as an important teacher, and that it's always important to have those sorts of people in our lives, people we draw from, people we can revere and trust. So the Buddha is one of what we call the three jewels of Buddhism. Dharma, which is a word you hear in the title, it's a word that translates a lot of different ways. We might think of it as teachings, specifically the Buddhist teachings, or even just truth in itself, that is something to be revered. So there are truths that come into my life and come into people's lives through Buddhism. And there are many truths that one would find outside of the strict parameters of Buddhism. Something that is important. If one is to recover, one should live in alignment with the truth. And the third jewel, no less important than the others, is Sangha, community. And that really the first two things would perhaps not be worthless, but they couldn't have their full meaning. We couldn't get our full benefit from the teachings or from the teacher if we didn't have one another, if we didn't have people to walk the path with, if we didn't have people to share both the struggle and the triumph with. And I've met some very close friends, people I love dearly, through this program, and it's allowed me to travel many different places. Not long after I had found Recovery Dharma, began graduate school, seminary in Chicago. Gave me instant community when spending time in Chicago. Some very dear friends made through this fellowship. I think that much is true for all recovery fellowship. I've always thought myself lucky in a way for all the ways that maybe I could think of recovery or addiction as a disadvantage. Recovery, I don't have to worry about where I might meet friends or where I might find people to rely upon. I know that in any city, any town, any country, I'm very likely to find an AA meeting, a Narcotics Anonymous meeting. And now that Recovery Dharma continues to grow, that's a pretty safe thing to say. I can find, particularly here in the States and even when traveling abroad, manage to find Recovery Dharma meetings. So I'll say more about that, but I always think it's important to qualify oneself. I'm not here speaking as a professional in any way. I'm not speaking. My profession is as a counselor and as in pastoral care and addiction counseling, but that's not the perspective I speak from tonight. It's as an alcoholic, an addict, someone who's really struggled with addiction. And I wouldn't have known it right away. I truly believe that the addiction for me started long time before I ever got drunk or got high or learned to use a behavior or people addictively. And all those things are true about my addiction. My addiction's rooted in my childhood, and I didn't have a childhood that was completely awful. I had people in my life that loved me. I had a great mother. I had family around me, and was relatively privileged. I had a roof over my head. I was never went hungry. I had a school to go to. I was safe. I didn't have to feel unsafe in the world around me. And in the home, though, there was addiction. And I'm from northeastern Pennsylvania, not terribly far from here. Pottsville was where, or I was actually born in Allentown, lived in Tamaqua and Pottsville and a number of places in Schuylkill County. So a coal mining area, not far away, under an hour away. In some ways, having lived down here in the Reading area now for about 6 years, there's a stark difference in the culture or way of life when you cross Interstate 78. And I knew Reading well. I've always had family here in this area, so it wasn't a place foreign to me. Growing up in Pottsville and thereabouts had some challenges that are perhaps unique. There's a long history of addiction and alcoholism, and it was an area that, not unlike Reading, was prosperous at one time due to coal mining and the industries that were here in Pennsylvania. When I was born, all that was well on its way to leaving the area. It was fairly impoverished, and again, I wasn't particularly well off, or I was well off, in fact, compared to a lot of people around me. And nevertheless, there was this culture, this way of life that even a legacy that I feel like I was born into, where I had no way of knowing that what it was like in my home was in any way problematic, because it was so much like that of everyone else around me. Lots of drinking in my family. There was violence in my house. Certainly there wasn't a lot of maybe what you would call emotional intelligence or vulnerability or safety. And it wasn't because people in my life didn't try. There were people who tried quite a bit. I do, however, remember some of the first things I can remember were the violence in the home, and also just feeling very, very uncomfortable in my own skin. Had a number of people I was very close to pass away when I was young, and that's really had a reciprocal effect on my life. Later, as I got into recovery and therapy, terms like abandonment issues were introduced to me, and I certainly have them. And maybe the 12 steps would tell me these were where some of my character defects or shortcomings came from. And those things have stayed with me into my adult years, and they particularly stayed with me into my teenage and young adult years, where I was an all right student. I had my moments as an athlete, but never in a way that I stood out like as the very best or at the top. And I always felt like maybe something was lacking, some sort of emptiness was there. There was definitely a lot of uneasiness, social anxiety, awkwardness. And when I got drunk for the first time, all of that went away. And it was a feeling that I didn't know I was waiting for my entire life. And I have a very vivid memory of thinking, I need to do this as often as I can. I will do whatever I can to feel this way, this absence of that uneasiness. It felt like a solution. Maybe that's not a word I would have used. Getting sober, I came to realize that was my solution for a time. Alcohol, drugs, whatever I could do to take myself outside of myself. And years later in therapy and in having conversations with my mother about my recovery and my addiction, I didn't quite know it at the time, but she said, I could tell you were going to be an addict. For one, your father and his father, they all were. So there was a family tree, there was a genetic component, but apparently I was very obsessive about things. Baseball cards, comic books, the Phillies. When I became a teenager, I started to get very obsessive about music and a record collection. But nothing like when I got drunk for the first time. And there's where I found all of my friends, where I found all of the ways in which I started to connect. And um, it did things for me. I wouldn't have become an addict. I wouldn't have got addicted if it didn't help. And of course, those benefits were very short lived and they came at a terrible cost later. But for a time, it worked, and I found friends that I still love and care um, deeply for. Our relationship has had to change drastically over the years, but um, I had friends that also grew up in difficult homes and with these sorts of problems that I had or these shortcomings, and there was community, and um, that still resonates till today as well. Because now more so, I like to spend my time around recovering addicts, but I still primarily enjoy being around addicts. There's something about our character, there's something about our experience, what we've seen in the world, maybe particularly once we get clean, what is important, or um, there's a vulnerability, there's a genuineness that is there amongst addicts, and a very deep, what I feel is a spiritual bond. And after a heck of a lot of suffering, it's a word we use a lot in Buddhism, suffering, dissatisfaction, suffering. That included losing relationships, losing opportunities, car accidents, fights, all sorts of things that were very troubling, including a few suicide attempts. I entered treatment when I was 22 for the first time, the only time I ever went to treatment. And it was the first time I started to learn some of these things. I was spending time around other people in recovery. And my father was in recovery for a period of time in his life. And what I knew of AA, what I knew of treatment was very influenced by his experience. And it wasn't quite what I wanted. And I started to see that there was something very different that I could probably only have known once I myself engaged that process. And there weren't things like Recovery Dharma, or there's another Buddhist fellowship out there called Refuge Recovery, which Recovery Dharma grew out of. It's still around. I'm biased in favor of Recovery Dharma for some what I feel are some important reasons. But at the time, there was no Buddhist recovery. The only game in town was Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous. And those two fellowships, maybe AA just a bit more than NA, but two fellowships that I actively engaged in my early years, my early attempts at getting sober. I met some people that, we've gone our separate ways in life, but there'll be people who conversations I've had with them and experiences we shared in and outside of treatment. I'll never forget them. And I work at the rehab where I went to treatment, and there will just be moments on days when I walk across campus, and this was 17 years ago now, that I'll get flashbacks to some experiences from 2003. And usually it's something that, warms my heart, or if I'm having a difficult day, or if I'm just caught up in the busyness and stress of the job, I think of these guys that I shared that experience with. And one of the things that really helped me was having, it inspired me for the work I ultimately ended up pursuing, was working with a few of the spiritual care folks when I was a patient. And sure, there are probably many people listening who would know the name Father Bill, and the influence he had on me was immense. And for a Catholic priest to influence someone, encouraging them to find whatever spiritual path worked, including diverging away from the Catholic Church. I owe that man my life, and it was there and through him and some of my other therapists and counselors that I was introduced to meditation. And it wasn't the same kind of visceral, immediate effect that I got from alcohol and other drugs, where that noise in my head would turn off. Actually, the first few times meditating, that noise kind of turned up a little bit. I was encouraged to follow through. And in time, the noise really started to change and shift. And even if it was there, I had a different relationship to it. So it altered the course of my life incredibly. I often wonder what life would have been like if I was able to stay sober from that point on. I was young. I thought I knew better than some people that I didn't think they were. I didn't think they were stupid people. I didn't think that they were people that had no idea what they were talking about. And I did think I knew better, or maybe I could take their warnings and still do some things that I wanted to do. And the folly of youth led me back towards using, and perhaps I just wasn't done. When I think back now how bad I was hurting before I got clean for the first time, it's a wonder that I could talk myself back into that. But that was about 6 years of back and forth and in and out of sobriety in many different forms, very often just white knuckling my sobriety. I'd gotten married. I'd gotten into graduate school. There was a number of things that I did, and sometimes those things were enough to keep me sober. And some of that graduate school included studying Buddhism, included studying meditation. And it just never quite worked when I was using. I thought it could. I thought there must be some relationship, or reading books or listening to, maybe that does work for some people. I'm not sure. But certainly when I ultimately got clean in 2009 in a very desperate, sad place, a place where I was floundering in a lot of ways, I thought, well, I know one thing that I can get back to for certain is meditation, and dove back into Buddhism in a very serious way and started studying scripture and started studying more contemporary authors. And one of the things I ultimately came across was a very fundamental teaching of the Buddha, that if you want to find freedom, if you want to find enlightenment, you have to stay away from intoxicants. It just doesn't work. The mind can't be settled. It can't grow, or it can't find enlightenment if it's under the influence. It's as important to avoid those things as it is to avoid lying, stealing, killing, or causing harm with your sexuality. Sobriety is as important as those other four things. And when I dove back in, I was struggling somewhat with some of the encouragements in AA. And some of that was me, if I'm being honest. I can be, at times, I can pick things apart too much. I can overanalyze things. And there are certainly ways that people approach the 12 steps that don't work so very well for me. So what I ended up finding was people that were taking a very deliberate Buddhist approach to recovery. And that started by finding people online. It started by having to travel to meditation retreats and reading books, listening to podcasts, and meanwhile, finding Alcoholics Anonymous again and having a very good experience there. For the first time, taking a very deep dive at step work and translating things within the 12 steps as I needed them to translate. And of course, there is in step 11 an encouragement towards meditation. And those things worked really well for me. And it was maybe 2013, after getting clean in 2009, that a teacher I was studying with, and I was on retreat with, said, "Oh, it's kind of on the West Coast now, but we're starting a Buddhist recovery fellowship." At the time, it was all called Refuge Recovery, and that it sounded very attractive to me. The principles of Buddhism, the Four Noble Truths, which talk about how there is suffering in life and how attachments and craving perpetuate suffering, and perpetuate all sorts of confusions, including addiction. And a very simple path, we call it the Eightfold Path, an encouragement towards living the right way, in a very loose way, something we might call ethics or morals, that these were things that I could place some trust in. And as I started to work them, my suffering went down. So not only was I able to not use, by the time I quit using, I really didn't want to use anymore. And I didn't go to treatments. I probably would have benefited immensely from that. The opportunity just wasn't there, or I wasn't aware of any opportunities. And it wasn't hard to refrain from putting drugs or alcohol in my body. It was very hard to have stability in my life. It was very hard to have skillful relationships and happy relationships. And AA and Buddhism gave me those things. When I started to follow practicing spiritual principles from both traditions, my life changed radically. And one thing that happened in the meantime, the marriage for me ended. It ended in recovery, in a way that was painful, but ultimately very good in the long run. And I found myself moving down here to the Reading area, not terribly long after, in many ways for a job, and in some ways for a new relationship. And a couple of years later, things were transitioning for me again. I was involved in the AA community in this area. I think it's wonderful. I think there's great recovery in our local AA community here. And there was a few folks I knew that had said, should we try this? Should we see if a Buddhist recovery group would work around here? And it worked. We were given some free space to hold our meetings in at the Unitarian Church in Reading, and I didn't know how many people would ever end up showing up. I made a Facebook group and put out some events, and for a while it was me and maybe one or two other people, and we had one book, one basic text. We would read it, passing it back and forth. We would sit together and meditate. And we were the only group in Pennsylvania at the time. The closest groups to us, there was one group in Brooklyn, one in Washington, D.C. They were the two closest meetings to us. And eventually, other groups started forming. Sometimes people were traveling to us from nearby cities, Lancaster and Chester County and Lehigh Valley, and people started coming, and then they started forming their own groups. And I forget what the count is at now, and COVID's kind of derailed a few things in terms of how many groups are meeting live, but there's quite a few meetings now in Pennsylvania, and gotten to know so many of them, got to do meditation retreats with so many people in this area and all throughout southeastern Pennsylvania in particular. So it's been something that has been a very important part of my life for the last 5 years. We started this meeting here in Reading in 2015, and so 5 years strong. Our fellowship is not radically dissimilar to what you would be familiar with through Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous. There's or other groups like Celebrate Recovery and Smart Recovery. At the end of the day, I don't want to speak for any other group. It's about connections and about people, and the idea of one person helping another after they've themselves have recovered or they have found wellness or hope in life. And um, some of the basics would be that we too have a mentor mentee relationship, what maybe you would know as a sponsor and sponsee kind of set up in our fellowship. We just don't use that language. We use the language of mentor and mentee. And there's a program of recovery that we work based on these teachings of the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. If you've done step work, particularly in the Narcotics Anonymous tradition, you might recognize the process of writing on each portion of the steps, writing on each step. And slowly over time, that practice has continued to build in Recovery Dharma, answering a fairly rigorous set of questions, which asked me to take what can sometimes be a difficult look at myself to see how have my behaviors perpetuated my addiction, perpetuated the difficulties in my life and in the lives of people around me. So noticing that there is this immense suffering in my life, much of which at first it was present. There were these there are a lot of factors that go into, in my opinion, one becoming an addict. There's a number of contemporary Buddhist teachers and even people commenting from neuroscience and biology, which say, like, it's not our fault that we like when things feel good and we don't like when they hurt. And when things hurt bad a lot, it can leave some very deep impressions, and it could really stay with us. And if it hurts bad enough, long enough, we'll do anything not to hurt. And so there's a basic way in which my biology is rooted in addiction. There's thousands of years of evolution behind me, which I'm programmed to want to chase after what feels good, get as much of that as I can, and in many ways to avoid pain at all costs. This program of Recovery Dharma, or these Buddhist principles on which it's based, they suggest that there's a much higher tolerance for pain that we're also built with, and that just because there's an inclination, or just because there's good reason, a good friend of mine always says, when talking about themselves or talking about other people in recovery, that we come about our issues honestly. We didn't become addicts on our own. And as I mentioned, there was a fair amount of pain and suffering and things that it wasn't unreasonable to not want to feel. And I also didn't have the best role models in my life. And that's not just my family, but so many people I grew up around, the culture that I grew up in northeastern Pennsylvania, the American culture we live in. There's a lot that suggests that if I take this pill, if I buy this product, if I get this degree, whatever it might be, that I'll be better. Things will be okay. I could, in a more instant way, chase those things out of my life. And perhaps I can for a limited amount of time. And there's a greater reward. There's a more lasting solution, a more durable solution, and real happiness that can come through a more delayed form of gratification. So in some ways, what the program of recovery that's there in Recovery Dharma, or the 12 steps, or any other program that holds the mirror up to us, there's some suffering that comes at first. It's really hard to see some of these things about us. There's some ugly truths, or I didn't even remember everything. I had to take an honest look at myself. I had to know what parts of myself were keeping me stuck in cycles. I had to really take stock and do whatever I could to make right some of the harms that I brought into this world because of my addiction. Things that sometimes weren't my fault, and they certainly, though, were my responsibility. That's not an easy process. Anybody that works a program of recovery, if they tell you it was easy, they're lying, or they didn't work a rigorous program. And I know for me, that was the only way that I could find relief. And what both Recovery Dharma or the 12 steps would say is a spiritual solution, meaning as opposed to alcohol, which we use a word to describe alcohol, or a name for alcohol is spirits. That's an illusion of real spirituality, of real peace, of real friendship and relationship. And so while taking these difficult looks at myself, I also had this community, this sangha around me of people that really cared. And I couldn't imagine that at a certain point in my life. I was very isolated. Sometimes we talk about our years in addiction in ways that might not always be accurate. I've heard people describe their active using years as being completely morally bankrupt and completely alone and isolated. Maybe that could be true. That wasn't completely true for me. I used to drink and get high with, as I said, people I cared about and people who cared about me. We just never really knew how to help or support each other. We lost friends to addiction. We lost friends to arrests and all sorts of things. The only way I knew how to help somebody was to buy them a drink to get them high, or sit around and try to process some emotions while under the influence and never really get anywhere, or make promises that we were going to do better together and hold each other accountable, and never did that last, if it ever even got off the ground. And the types of relationships I've had in recovery, that I couldn't imagine that existed, and have found similar relationships through just being a part of Buddhist community, of being a part of other spiritual communities, have wonderful colleagues in my life, have a great relationship, and I feel very blessed, and wouldn't be the first person you'd probably ever hear say this, but I certainly didn't get what I deserved in life, and in a very good way, because if I had to face all of the consequences of all my actions, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be speaking in this role. I probably literally wouldn't be alive, and or my circumstances would look very, very different. And so it's a great joy to know what Recovery Dharma has become, and I've over the years been involved in some upper level service positions, and gone to many of the national and regional gatherings. Sometimes that's not my most favorite stuff to do, talk about policies and procedures, but it's really been worthwhile to help to get to be a part of shaping something, and still very much feel immense gratitude for the other recovery fellowships like Alcoholics Anonymous I've been a part of, and the colleagues I I have through the Rise Center and the many different perspectives. And I hope you do get to hear a number of the other speakers as well. The meetings we have together are quite fun, and it's great that there's this place where the many different perspectives and avenues to recovery have like really come together and aligned, and to have a place to meet and to benefit one another and share resources. And yeah, it's really cool to be a part of. And I was very happy to get to speak tonight, and I want to leave some time for questions that might be coming in. I've seen a few things that are being passed along through the chat function. So why don't I just end my share there formally? And I don't know if Yvonne, you want to read me some questions?
Absolutely.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Absolutely. I'm here, Matt. And so thank you, first of all, for I just felt your passion and your authenticity resonate. And I know talking virtually is kind of hard for some folks, but you were able to just kind of speak to your journey and in such a profound way that I just, related to so much that you shared. And I think many of us that are watching probably were just nodding our heads like, yeah, I felt that emptiness. I know what you mean by feeling alone and feeling kind of isolated and that type of thing. So before we end the night, I wanted to really just thank you for your time. There are some questions here that I will read. One person asked, how can someone learn more about Recovery Dharma? Is there a website that they can go to?
Yeah, it's a great question. Long before COVID, like we were, as I said, we were the only group in Pennsylvania. There was nobody around. So there was websites and Facebook groups and virtual meetings that have been around in the Recovery Dharma world long before COVID. So I feel like we were fortunate that we were out ahead of that curve a little bit. And so recoverydharma.org. And if you were to, if you're on social media, our group has a page on Facebook, Recovery Dharma of Reading. There's a page you would find for a group for folks all throughout Southeast Pennsylvania. So it's SEPA, Recovery Dharma. And there's a Mid-Atlantic group. So that's like, just like other recovery fellowships, there's breakdowns of the country and the world by region. And we're in the Mid-Atlantic region. So we hear more or less all of us in the Philadelphia area, and then groups from New York City, New York State, Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, some parts of Virginia. So there are regional activities, and there's larger groups just for the entire Recovery Dharma Fellowship. There's some pretty helpful groups for people. Like there's an LGBTQ site. There's a Facebook group for folks that approach process addiction, so things like sex and love or gambling recovery through this perspective. There's a lot of resources online, and if you do also Google Recovery Dharma online, there's I don't know the exact number, but more than a few meetings every day that take place through Zoom. And I guess something we're all kind of getting used to. I've done a lot of my education, and I've done a lot through Zoom, so I'm kind of used to this. I look forward, and I guess that's going to happen pretty soon. Our meeting in Reading will likely be going back live again pretty soon as we sort a few things out. But that's on Thursday nights. Right now it's at 7 o'clock. We might look at a new time, but certainly if you find our Facebook page, we'll keep that updated. And I guess the last thing I would say, if you want to know more, there is a basic text. It's just called Recovery Dharma. It's available on the website. It's free to download, like PDF, or in a Kindle format, and you can buy a printed copy from Amazon for like $4. So the text, and there's an audiobook of the text too, if anybody is visually impaired. That's a free download as well. So many ways to connect online.
That's great. That's really helpful. And then I have another question. Do you have meetings for beginners in meditation? And if so, how do you recommend starting this program of recovery?
Yeah, because we're a smaller fellowship, we only do really have the one meeting every week. It's always pretty much at a basic level. One doesn't have to come in as an advanced meditator. One doesn't ever have to be an advanced meditator. I'm a certified meditation teacher myself, so I often lead the meeting, and there's a few friends and peers in the program that have become great meditation teachers. They can lead meditations themselves. And that's a great place to start, just coming to a meeting, or if you join a virtual meeting, somebody will be leading that. There's recorded versions. There's the audio book, and there are some recordings that go along with that. And one can find, there's an app that many of us use called the Insight Timer, INSIGHT timer. And if you type in Recovery Dharma there's many guided recordings that are geared just towards folks in recovery. And yeah, that's a great way to get started. Or there's teachers that more or less were involved in there was Buddhist communities out of which Recovery Dharma grew out of. So teachers like Tara Brock or Jack Cornfield, they have so many of their practices that are available for free online. And I don't get any commission for this, but I think their books are great, right? Like yeah. You could find a lot worse teachers than those two, and any colleagues or any people that they might suggest as you read their books. It's a very decent way to start. But yeah, hopefully be able to join our in-person meetings in the very near future.
You and I have been, when I came on earlier, I was talking about language akin to recovery. I used recovery, well-briety, sobriety, classifying myself as a person in long-term recovery, addict. Can you talk about your idea? I know we're moving in a time whereby language becomes very important to individuals, and I guess I'm contributing this to somebody that might be watching us for the first time. Is how do you talk about your labeling of yourself and that importance for you versus somebody else who might see themselves a little bit differently? Because I don't, as we go forward, and you and I are a little bit more seasoned, but I know that we've had folks that are new, maybe they're 1 day sober, they're 30 days sober, and the importance of identification, self-revelation of who they are.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the most important piece was knowing that I had a problem and accepting that. And I got into recovery the first time after a failed suicide attempt that was accompanied by a lot of other chaos in my life. So I didn't have a lot of questions about, like, was I or wasn't I an alcoholic? And I think it's really awesome if people get clean or start to explore before they get to those depths, right? Like, that would be awesome. So yeah. It's always a good thing if we're getting to a place where we want to explore recovery before we're sure. A population that I've worked with as a addiction counselor is teenagers and young adults, and I hope I'm talking to you before you're shooting dope or before you're smoking methamphetamine. Like, that's great. Like, and if you're just smoking weed in your parents' basement, like, I think it's fair to question. One of the other things that, as a professional counselor, actual diagnosis hasn't used the word addict or alcoholic in 40 years.
Yeah.
1980 was when we stopped. So right now we use words like substance abuse, substance use disorder, and mild, moderate, severe. So I think all that's fine. Like if someone has a mild use disorder and they like, I don't know if I'm an addict. Oh, okay. That's one of the reasons I think that Recovery Dharma has just stuck to, well, we'll introduce ourselves by our first names. We'll still stay anonymous in terms of our last name, particularly to protect ourselves, but also not to pretend like we can talk on behalf of, or that, like, as I said, like, this is my perspective. It's not like the official Recovery Dharma perspective. Anything I said tonight. So I'm pretty comfortable with being in most recovery meetings. So if I'm in AA, Matt, I'm an alcoholic. NA, Matt, I'm an addict. Al-Anon, I might call myself a codependent. I can certainly call myself an adult child of an alcoholic. Person in long-term recovery works really well for me. Like, I think all that's very fair. And I kind of like the invitational aspect of not needing to qualify myself, or particularly if it's something that reinforces shame, then maybe we should be getting rid of those labels. For me, it was always a way to identify, or particularly if I shared anything that was of help to anyone tonight, like, I guess it's important for me to tell you I'm an addict, so you know that, right? Or that, like, it wasn't a fabricated account, or it wasn't something that I put together from, like, studying my books. This isn't theoretical stuff. This was from experience. So I got to wear a shirt and tie to work every day, and I don't always love doing that. But sometimes then I get to a meeting afterwards, and I might look a little, like, wound up a little too tightly, right? If who I was when I first got clean walked in and saw that person, I would have thought, why are they here?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I want people to know that, like, yeah, indeed, I was a gutter punk as I was coming in. And that's why, like, it kind of feels second nature at this point to just identify whatever the culture is around me. And plus, then I don't have to listen to people criticize me if I identify the wrong way. Like, I think it's ridiculous when somebody at an AA meeting says, "Don't call yourself an addict in here." Like, to me, that, again, personal opinion, but I think that's utterly ridiculous. So I keep it simple for myself in that way too, because I don't feel like arguing with somebody when I'm at a meeting either.
Sure. I agree with you. Again, you and I come from a place that this was a while ago, and there was really some regimen around what you can say and what you can't say. And what I witnessed were people were actually walking out the door because they didn't want somebody telling them what to do, right? And which is why we emphasize that these are guidelines, these are suggestions, and you take the suggestions and you leave what doesn't apply to you, which brings me to my next point, because I heard you mention your practice of Recovery Dharma, but you also mentioned that you will still from time to time attend mutual aid support groups, 12-step help groups. And I think it's important for individuals that might be watching that there's nothing wrong with, for yourself, for your own pathway of engaging your own well-briety. If you want to go both paths, that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Somebody put it to me early on, get in where you fit in. And there was, like, certainly early on, I think I liked Narcotics Anonymous literature better. And I found a few people I really liked in AA, including the first person who sponsored me. And I was really, I don't want to say I'm lucky because he wasn't the only person, but I do feel very fortunate to have had this particular gentleman who, when I came to him, when it was time to work on my 4-step in AA, said, "Hey, I found this Narcotics Anonymous study guide. Like, I want to write on what's in there. How about it?" And yeah, certainly. Let's do that. And so, no, you don't have to follow the rigid 4-column approach in the AA book, and that works. That's worked for a lot of people. But yeah, I think it's as long as I don't spread myself too thin, right? As long as I can, like if I went to a different recovery fellowship every night of the week, and I needed to go to meetings every day of the week when I got clean, I probably couldn't have given the one thing enough attention, right? Like I needed to buckle down a little bit. It was great to bring in some voices from some other places, and certainly you read that in the big book, right? Like to me, it's always very funny for people to take like a overly rigid or orthodox approach to a book that says like, we know very little. More is going to be revealed. Everything in here is a suggestion. To make really firm rules around that, just I don't get it. And people have like scoffed at me when I've said that. So it's a strange thing to me that I never understood. And I think a lot of people started to not understand that, and that's why we're at this like different place today, which I really like. And yeah, so if I wanted to get to I could probably, if I was so motivated to drive that far, and I'm not right now. Like I could get to a Recovery Dharma meeting every night if I spent a couple nights a week in Lancaster and Philly and Exton and the Lehigh Valley. Like that could happen. But if I was here in Reading, like I'm going to get to one meeting a week right now. Probably good that I'd be going to some AA meetings on top of that, or doing some other good things for myself, like in sobriety as well. You know, those, it doesn't all have to happen in these peer-led things. They're definitely the cheapest option though. And 'cause you can pay a lot of money and do a lot of therapy, and that's good too, right? It's really good. And I couldn't afford to go to therapy every night if I wanted to.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Matt, again, for sharing a little bit of your journey about who you are and what happened in your life today. And so I'm just really appreciative. And just as we're signing off, because we're coming to that hour of 7 o'clock, we want to invite you to tune in next Tuesday evening for us, where actually we'll be having another mutual aid support called Al-Anon. And we'll have a representative from Al-Anon talk a little bit more about families, because this is a family disease. And so families can get well together. And I also lastly want to invite you to check out our website at berksrise.org, where we're having information about our Recovery Out Loud series. And we're also inviting you to give us a 30-second video or picture with a small caption about what recovery means to you. And if you're willing to do that for us, we're going to in turn send you a nice little t-shirt that has the Rise Center on the front and the Recovery Out Loud series on the back. So we're appreciative of your time. We know that you could be anywhere in the world right now doing a number of things, but we're so glad that you joined us tonight. We hope to see you next week, next Tuesday specifically at 6 o'clock to hear about Al-Anon. In the meantime, stay safe, enjoy your recovery, and be blessed. Have a great night.